In the gently sloping farmlands of central Illinois, not far from where the prairie wind once whispered across open fields, stood a building that history tried to forget, a place once praised as a holy beacon of Catholic devotion. But beneath its stained glass windows and marble altars, Sacred Heart Seminary hid something older than its stone foundation, something darker. Between the years 1847 and 1862, 17 young men vanished behind its doors, and not a single one was ever seen again. To the public, they were simply transferred, sent on missionary assignments, moved to silent retreats in distant lands. That was the church's story, and for over a century it was enough to keep the questions at bay. But fragments of letters recently discovered beneath the chapel floor told another tale. A tale drenched in shadows and soaked in the blood of innocence. Those 17 men weren't called to serve. They were taken, sold, erased. Their disappearances orchestrated not by chance or misfortune, but by a criminal enterprise so well hidden, it reached the highest seats of power in the American Catholic hierarchy. The true horror lies in who ran Sacred Heart during those missing years. According to church records, it was 3 highly educated Irish priests with glowing credentials and the Vatican's full blessing. But investigators now believe those men weren't priests at all. They were imposters, con men from Dublin's underworld who hijacked the identities of real clergymen, silenced them during an overseas voyage, and assumed their lives as a disguise for something far more sinister. But before Sacred Heart became a trap, it was a dream. A promise. In the 1840s, America was in the grip of violent change. Irish immigrants flooded in, escaping the famine that turned their homeland into a graveyard. They brought their Catholic faith with them, fierce, proud, and unshakable. But that devotion made them targets. In cities like Philadelphia and Boston, Catholic churches were burned to the ground. Priests were dragged into the street and beaten. Nuns had to flee their convents in the dead of night. Anti-Catholic hatred was not only common, it was organized. And in that hostility, the Catholic Church saw an opportunity. They needed American-born priests, men who could speak without foreign accents, who could move through Protestant communities without suspicion. Sacred Heart Seminary, founded in 1845 on 400 windswept acres southwest of Chicago, was built to meet that need. It would train the first true American generation of Catholic clergy. From the outside, it was stunning. Designed by famed Irish architect Patrick Keeley, the building rose from the prairie like a Gothic cathedral. Towering windows caught the sunrise. The bell tower could be heard for miles. Inside, it held a theological library that rivaled any in the country and was outfitted with luxuries unheard of in rural Illinois. Gas lighting, indoor plumbing, a full heating system. Wealthy Catholic families from Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Louis poured money into the seminary. They believed they were building the future of American Catholicism. At its head stood Father Superior Edmund Walsh, a towering man with silver in his beard and eyes that never looked away. He carried letters of recommendation from Ireland's most powerful bishops. With him were Rector Thomas Murphy and Dean Patrick O'Brien, 2 more scholars of impressive pedigree, men said to have studied at the finest European institutions, fluent in Greek and Latin, masters of canon law and moral theology. Their credentials were impeccable. Their presence inspired awe, and every word out of their mouths was a lie. By the fall of 1847, 12 young men had enrolled in Sacred Heart's first class, sons of German, Irish, and French immigrants. Some were converts from Protestant families. All had left their homes with a dream of becoming priests. None of them knew they were stepping into a carefully crafted trap. One by one, over the next 15 years, they would vanish, and Sacred Heart would become something far more terrifying than anyone had imagined. Their routines at Sacred Heart seemed structured, even holy. Every day began at 4:30 a.m. with morning prayers. By 5, the The students were seated in the grand chapel beneath painted ceilings and candle-lit arches, listening to Latin hymns echo off stone. From there, it was a strict schedule of theology classes, ancient languages, and long hours maintaining the grounds. Everything seemed in order, on the surface. But nothing inside those walls happened by accident. Each of the original 12 had been hand-picked, not for spiritual promise, but for what they could be worth: their family wealth, their physical strength, their intellect, their usefulness, and most importantly, how easily they could disappear. The 3 men posing as clergy had a system, one perfected before a single student set foot on seminary grounds. The first to vanish was Michael Brennan, a bright and devout 22-year-old from Chicago. His family ran several successful grocery stores in Irish neighborhoods, and they'd saved for years to afford the seminary's steep tuition. Michael had shown remarkable promise in theology, particularly in moral law, and had even been given access to seminary financial records under Father Walsh's supervision. To anyone watching, he was on track for priesthood and the pride of his community. Then came the snowstorm. February 1848 brought one of the worst blizzards in Illinois history. Roads vanished beneath towering drifts. No one could come in or out. And that's when Michael was summoned to Father Walsh's private office, alone after dark. He was seen walking the long corridor, portfolio in hand, just after supper. Several students heard raised voices later that evening, an argument, then silence. Michael never came back. At morning mass, Father Walsh explained his absence with practiced solemnity. Michael, he claimed, had received an urgent call during the night to minister to cholera victims near the Iowa border. Despite being a student, he had bravely volunteered, sacrificing comfort for service. The story sounded noble. And it was a lie. Michael's winter coat, boots, and gloves were still in his wardrobe. His prized silver rosary, a family heirloom from his grandmother, sat untouched on his nightstand. He hadn't packed anything. He hadn't told anyone, not even his roommate, Joseph Kennedy. When Joseph dared to ask questions, he was punished. Solitary prayer and fasting, locked in the seminary's underground chapel, a damp, windowless vault carved into the hillside, lit only by candle and bone-cold all year round. There, in the silence, Joseph heard things no prayer could quiet. Late at night, when all should have been still, he began hearing the sound of wagon wheels creaking over frozen ground above him. Horse hooves, hushed voices, always the same 3, and always followed by the same grim routine. Dragging noises, heavy lifting, muffled commands. Then the wagon would leave, headed south toward Springfield. By morning, nothing would seem amiss. On the 3rd night, Joseph saw them. Through a crusted basement window, he watched the shadows of 3 men loading a heavy, cloth-wrapped bundle into the back of a covered wagon. The way they moved, slow, careful, deliberate, wasn't how you handled luggage. It was how you carried something that could break, or had already been broken. He didn't tell anyone. Not then. The fear was too thick and the punishments too swift. But then, just 6 weeks later, another student disappeared. This time it was Thomas Gallagher, a gentle, soft-spoken young man from Milwaukee, son of immigrants who had sold their farm just to afford his education. On March 30th, 1848, he too was summoned after evening prayers, this time by Dean O'Brien, and like Michael, he never came back. Again, Father Walsh had an explanation. Thomas, struggling with impure thoughts, had chosen to leave the seminary in the night, seeking solitude, a monastery in the Wisconsin wilderness. But on his desk sat a half-written letter to his sister, speaking of joy, purpose, and his dreams of priesthood. It ended mid-sentence. The seminary was down to 10 students now, and those who remained had begun to understand something horrifying. They weren't being trained for holy service. They were being selected, one by one. By the end of spring, the whispers among the students had grown quieter, but sharper. What once had been a place of brotherhood now felt like a house with eyes in every wall. Every glance, every conversation, every movement was weighed for risk. Trust faded. Fear took its place. And Sacred Heart Seminary kept shrinking. The third disappearance came just before summer. Antoine Dubois, a French-American student from Detroit, vanished under nearly identical circumstances. His family had been fur traders, wealthy and well-connected. Antoine spoke several native languages and had wilderness survival skills few could match. He had written home the week before, thrilled about a new course in biblical interpretation. Then, without warning, he was gone. The story? Another emergency mission. This time to a frontier settlement facing unrest. But again, his belongings remained. Letters, clothing, his family's prayer book. His departure, like the others, made no sense. Next came Heinrich Weber, the soft-spoken son of German immigrants and Thomas Gallagher's closest friend. He'd asked one too many questions, quietly, respectfully, but the wrong ears had heard. One morning, his bed was empty. No goodbye, no explanation, only a note on the chapel door stating he'd been transferred to a seminary in Baltimore. A highly specialized program, they claimed, meant for German-speaking clergy, but not even a letter to his family, not even a farewell. By Christmas 1848, 7 students remained. 5 had disappeared in just under a year. The men in charge, Walsh, Murphy, O'Brien, seemed unaffected. If anything, they appeared more confident, as if their hold on the institution had tightened. Their possessions grew finer. Walsh now wore silk vestments, consulted a gold pocket watch, and lectured from behind a carved mahogany desk that hadn't been there the semester before. Murphy had new books, rare ones, leather-bound volumes no average seminary could afford. And O'Brien had a new black stallion, a gift, he said, from grateful parishioners in Ireland. But he never said which parish. Their absences also became more frequent. Trips to Chicago, journeys to St. Louis, private meetings with unnamed clergy. During these excursions, the students were left in the care of an elderly lay brother named Francis McManus, a man as nervous as he was quiet. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then, his eyes shifted like someone expecting danger around every corner. No one knew much about him. He claimed to be a religious assistant, but knew far too much about the property, including rooms and cellars no student had ever seen, and he always flinched when anyone mentioned the missing. By now, Joseph Kennedy was watching everything. He couldn't unsee what he'd witnessed during his week of punishment. The wagons, the voices, the shadows moving under torchlight. He began charting patterns, weather conditions, times of night, who was summoned, who wasn't. He noticed the disappearances always followed certain rules. They never occurred on weekends when church visitors might arrive. They happened during poor weather, cloudy nights, bitter cold, when the roads were nearly impassable, and they always followed private meetings with one of the 3 men. Especially Walsh. It wasn't just disappearances. Joseph started seeing changes in behavior. The priests no longer acted like men of the cloth. They acted like men with secrets to protect. They controlled everything: mail, movement, conversation. Students were no longer permitted to write home freely. Letters had to be approved. Outgoing mail was inspected. Incoming mail opened and read before it ever reached a student's hand. Then came the next disappearance. Quiet. Fast. No questions allowed. By early 1849, the seminary felt less like a school and more like a cage. 7 remained, but every one of them lived with the same unspoken fear. At night, they began sleeping in shifts. They kept mental lists of each other's belongings, rosaries, journals, pocket watches. So if another vanished, They'd know exactly what was left behind. And always, it came back to the same feeling. They weren't students anymore. They were inventory. Being watched, being weighed, being priced. No one said it aloud. But in the hollow spaces between candlelit prayers and whispered lectures, every remaining student had come to the same unspoken realization. Sacred Heart Seminary was no longer a place for faith. It was a machine, quiet, precise, and predatory. And then James O'Malley arrived. James was different from the others. He was older by a year or two, came from Detroit, and carried himself with a confidence that seemed unshakable. His father was a prominent merchant, well known across the Great Lakes. His uncle was a respected priest, with deep connections in the Catholic hierarchy. Unlike most of the students, sons of laborers and immigrants, James had grown up in privilege, and more importantly, he had been educated by private tutors who trained him not just in scripture and Latin, but in logic, observation, and the art of reading people. The priests welcomed him with smiles, but those smiles didn't reach their eyes. It didn't take long for James to sense something wasn't right. Students avoided eye contact. Meals were quiet, tense. Conversations dried up when the clergy entered the room, and too many beds sat empty for a seminary only in its second year. He asked questions. Casual at first. How many students had graduated? Where were they assigned? But the answers were vague. Faces turned pale, and Father Walsh grew colder with every inquiry. So James stopped asking aloud and started watching instead. By fall of 1849, James had begun assembling a private log. Times, dates, weather patterns, priestly movements. He noted when the wagons came and when they left. He paid attention to which students were summoned at night and what they left behind. He noticed how each disappearance aligned with some official excuse: disease, transfer, crisis, but always with holes in the story and always under a cloud of secrecy. His instincts screamed there was a pattern, and then he found proof. In the library, behind a loose section of floorboard near the theology shelves, James discovered a hidden space. Inside, carefully bundled in oilskin and twine, were letters. Dozens of them, some in English, some in French, some in Latin. They were coded, but not well enough. James recognized the method. A simple cipher, religious terms replacing financial ones. But once cracked, the content made his blood run cold. They weren't letters, they were contracts. The priests had been trafficking students. Each one described a shipment. Some were labeled by language ability, others by physical strength or obedience reliability. There were references to buyers in lumber mills, coal towns, and rural outposts. Each agreement sealed with descriptions so cold, so dehumanizing, they might as well have been livestock receipts. One passage read, 2 specimens shipped under cover of snow, Irish lad literate, useful for clerical tasks, German strong, obedient, assigned to coal operations, payment received in full. James read until his hands shook. Then he put the letters back, carefully, silently, as if they might scream if handled too roughly. That night he didn't sleep. He waited, listening. And just before 2 a.m., the familiar sounds returned. Wagon wheels crunching frost, muffled voices, Walsh, Murphy, O'Brien, grunts, dragging, then silence. It was happening again. Another life being stolen while the world slept. By morning, a bed was empty. The name was David Anderson, a quiet young man from Ohio, a convert, kind, gentle, gone. James didn't speak of what he'd found. Not yet. He needed more. He needed irrefutable proof. But from that day forward, he stopped pretending. He knew what Sacred Heart was. Not a seminary, not even a prison. It was a slaughterhouse, clean, quiet, and efficient. And if he wasn't careful, He'd be next on the list. James knew he had no allies left inside those walls. Not among the clergy, not among the frightened students who had learned that silence was safer than truth. So he kept to himself, wearing a mask of quiet devotion while secretly documenting everything. Names, dates, financial discrepancies, travel schedules, all of it. What unsettled him most wasn't just the vanishing students. It was the precision behind each disappearance. These weren't random or impulsive acts. They were transactions, executed with chilling discipline, disguised under layers of religious ritual, and protected by the absolute obedience Sacred Heart demanded from its students. He focused on the seminary's finances next. Tuition records, supply orders, donation ledgers. It didn't add up. The seminary wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Yet the number of students was shrinking, and their known income sources couldn't explain the influx of luxury items now appearing throughout the building. James watched as Father Walsh acquired new vestments lined with gold thread. Rector Murphy's office filled with imported theological texts. Dean O'Brien, once a humble preacher, now dressed like nobility and rode through the grounds on a stallion that must have cost more than a year's tuition. Where was the money coming from? The answer came in the form of more letters, hidden deeper this time in a crawl space behind the altar. James risked discovery to retrieve them, covered in dust, sealed with wax, each one written in a now familiar hand, Father Walsh. But they weren't addressed to church officials. They were orders, confirmations of payment, delivery schedules, client instructions, and the merchandise? Human beings. Educated young men, trained in discipline and obedience, stripped of identity and sold into forced labor. The language was calculated, sanitized. Shipment received. Specimens unfit. Substitute secured. Each line written by a man who had traded his soul long ago, if he'd ever had one to begin with. Worse still were the notes scrawled in the margins, markings that revealed internal debates between the three impostors, arguments over pricing, discussions about whether certain students were too recognizable to be moved, whether someone might talk, which meant James was already in danger. He doubled his efforts to get word out, quietly, strategically, but every letter he tried to send was intercepted. Every conversation he attempted to steer was shut down. The priests controlled the flow of all communication. Nothing left Sacred Heart without their eyes on it first. Even the other students were watched. James noticed Francis McManus, the quiet lay brother, always hovering nearby, pretending to clean, pretending to pray, but his eyes never stopped moving, and wherever James went, McManus was close behind. Then the threats began, not overt, not loud, but real. One night, James returned to his room to find his bed slashed open. No explanation, no apology, just a warning. Another morning, he found his personal journal missing, reappearing 2 days later, its pages rearranged as if someone had copied them before putting it back. And every evening, the same smell lingered in his room long after lights out. Tobacco, Walsh's brand. He knew he didn't have much time left. So he made a decision. If he couldn't get help from inside, he'd find someone outside, someone powerful enough to listen, someone with the authority to act. And fate delivered him just that. Word arrived of a special visitation, an apostolic inspection by a bishop sent directly from Rome. A man named Bishop Giovanni Montini, known for rooting out corruption in European dioceses. He had arrived in Chicago weeks earlier, traveling incognito, making unannounced visits to parishes across the Midwest. For the first time, James saw a flicker of hope. If he could get a message to Montini, if he could show him what Sacred Heart really was, there might still be a chance to end this nightmare. But first, he'd have to stay alive long enough to try. James knew Bishop Montini's visit might be his only window to escape the trap that Sacred Heart had become. But getting a message to him would be nearly impossible. Every letter, every conversation, every moment was monitored, and the longer he remained inside that place, the tighter the noose seemed to pull. So he studied the enemy. James began volunteering for errands, carrying books, fetching supplies, cleaning common areas, anything that gave him an excuse to move throughout the seminary grounds without raising suspicion. He was no longer just watching. He was preparing. He learned the layout, the rhythms. When McManus patrolled the halls, when Walsh and Murphy retired to their quarters, he mapped the locations of windows that opened, doors that creaked, and floorboards that betrayed the quietest step. Each detail mattered, because one wrong move wouldn't just cost him his life. It would doom anyone else he might try to save. His breakthrough came in the form of a name. A quiet conversation he overheard in the chapel between Murphy and O'Brien, their voices barely above a whisper. "Montini is staying with Bishop Quarter in Chicago," Murphy said. "For now, but he's already visited St. Mary's and St. Jerome's without notice." James froze behind the column where he'd been polishing candle holders. That was all he needed. He couldn't write to Montini directly. The priests would see it, but he could hide a message inside something else, something only another theologian would notice. He spent 3 days crafting the letter. Written entirely in Latin, it posed as a theological query, asking for spiritual clarification on the Church's position regarding obedience when faced with possible violations of canon law. But buried between the lines, hidden in phrasing only a scholar would recognize, was a coded cry for help. It asked a single question: what must a faithful servant of God do when his superiors have abandoned all light? The answer, James hoped, would be swift and silent. But getting it out was another matter. He used his allowance to bribe a local farmer, Samuel Morrison, who delivered milk and eggs twice a week from a nearby farm. Morrison had long been suspicious of the seminary's activities. He had seen the wagons moving at night. He had found student belongings tangled along the boundary fence, and though he never spoke of it openly, his eyes always carried a certain unease. James cornered him during a delivery. "No one can know," James said, slipping the letter into a sack of oats. "Not yet. Please." Morrison gave him a look that said more than words. He didn't ask questions, just nodded and rode off toward Springfield, where he promised to post the letter in town. Then came the waiting. Days passed, then a week, and with each passing night, James felt the pressure building. McManus watched him more closely now. Walsh seemed less patient, more irritable. O'Brien's smiles had turned thin and cold. Then one afternoon, without warning, an announcement was made. Sacred Heart would receive an unplanned visit from Bishop Giovanni Montini within the week. His arrival would be unannounced, no date given, no time confirmed. Just a warning that he might appear at any moment. Panic crept through the faculty. Walsh ordered rooms scrubbed, files locked, student correspondence reviewed. Murphy held back-to-back private confessions with every student, carefully steering questions toward obedience, loyalty, silence. James said nothing. He kept his head down, cleaned, prayed, waited. And then, late one Thursday night, a single candle appeared in the window of St. Patrick's Church in Millfield, a tiny chapel 10 miles from the seminary. It was the signal James had asked Morrison to use if Montini agreed to meet. He slipped out that same night, through the laundry chute, across the frost-covered field, avoiding the lantern light of patrolling eyes. And before dawn, he stood face to face with the one man who could change everything. Bishop Montini, small in stature, dark eyes that never blinked, and a voice like thunder wrapped in velvet. "Speak," the bishop said, in perfect Latin. And James did. He laid everything bare: the missing students, the hidden letters, the coded contracts disguised as church correspondence. He described the underground rooms, the wagon wheels at night, the threats, the surveillance. He recounted the names of every boy who vanished, the families who never heard back, and the lies crafted to cover each one. Bishop Montini never interrupted. He listened with hands clasped tightly in front of him, his expression carved from granite. When James finished, silence hung heavy in the cold sacristy air. "You've done something very dangerous," Montini said at last, "and very brave." Then he asked questions, sharp, specific, and relentless. He wanted names, dates, physical descriptions, travel routes, hidden caches. James answered everyone, and as he spoke, he saw something he hadn't expected. Montini wasn't just shocked. He was furious, but not surprised. "There have been whispers," Montini admitted. "Irregularities, untraceable funds, unexplained absences in several institutions. But until now, nothing solid, no witness, no proof." James handed over copies he'd made of the most damning letters. Crude translations, payment summaries, locations, times. Montini reviewed them quickly and then folded them into his coat without a word. He turned to the altar and crossed himself. "God has brought us here for a reason," he said. "Now we burn the rot out." Within hours, Vatican orders were dispatched through encrypted messages. Montini didn't trust local bishops, not with something this big. His authority came straight from Rome, and he wielded it like a blade. He summoned federal marshals quietly, choosing only men whose loyalty was beyond question. He looped in trusted clergy from neighboring dioceses, and he laid out a plan, not just to investigate, but to trap. They would strike at dawn. No warnings, no interviews, no preliminary visits. Sacred Heart would be surrounded before the sun cleared the trees, every exit blocked, every document seized, every lie exposed. James returned to the seminary that same night, slipping through the laundry chute just before curfew. His absence had gone unnoticed, or so it seemed. But something in the air felt different, heavy, tense, and he was right. The next morning, he found a note tucked beneath his pillow. "We know." No signature, just 2 words, and a small black thread tied to the corner, a symbol he'd seen once before on a set of priestly vestments now buried in Walsh's private wardrobe. The message was clear. They were on to him. He spent the next 2 days pretending, eating, studying, praying, all while knowing the clock was ticking and that with every breath he stood closer to death. Then the night before the planned raid, the priests made their move. James was summoned to Father Walsh's office just after dinner. He walked the long corridor alone, each step a silent war between dread and defiance. The office door creaked open, revealing Walsh seated behind his towering desk, Murphy and O'Brien flanking him like shadows. They didn't waste time. "You've been digging," Walsh said, no longer bothering to mask his accent or soften his tone. "Asking questions, moving where you shouldn't." James didn't respond. "We don't like disobedience," Murphy added. "You were meant to serve, to submit. Instead, you chose defiance." O'Brien stepped closer, his voice low and sharp. "There's a price for that." They offered him a choice: stay silent and cooperate, or disappear like the rest. He could even be rewarded, brought into the operation, use his family connections to identify more candidates, share in the profits, live, or vanish. James asked for time, a night to pray on it. Walsh stared at him for a long moment, then granted it. But his eyes said what his words didn't. There would be no more chances. That night, James didn't sleep. He sat by the window, eyes locked on the distant road. And just before dawn, the first lanterns appeared through the mist. Help had arrived. The first rays of morning barely touched the frost when they came. 12 men in total, some in clerical robes, others in plain coats. Among them were trusted federal marshals, Vatican investigators, and priests handpicked by Bishop Montini himself. They moved swiftly and without a sound, surrounding Sacred Heart from all sides like a tightening noose. No bell was rung, no warning given. By the time the seminary stirred from its slumber, it was already too late. James stood waiting at the chapel steps, his heart pounding as Bishop Montini emerged from the mist, eyes locked on the building that had devoured so many lives. He gave a single nod, and the doors were breached. What followed was not chaos, it was precision. Every office searched, every room inspected, lockboxes cracked open, ledgers seized, students ushered into the chapel for protection and questioning. For the first time in years, the air inside Sacred Heart was no longer heavy with fear. It was electrified by the force of truth, finally unchained. Walsh didn't resist. Not at first. He met Montini in the grand hallway, robes flowing, voice calm. "This is blasphemy," he declared, "an affront to the Church. You'll answer to Rome." But Montini already had. He handed over documents bearing the papal seal, proof that Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien had never been ordained, never assigned, never even recorded as clergy within any diocese. Their real names: Seamus McKenna, Liam Doherty, Fergus Lynch. Criminals from Dublin's underworld, long vanished from Europe's radar. The blood drained from Walsh's face. Murphy stepped back. O'Brien reached for the door, but the marshals were faster. In seconds, all three were in chains. The search turned brutal. Beneath the seminary floors, behind hidden walls and beneath stone stairwells, investigators uncovered the unthinkable. Detailed ledgers tracking sales, crates of personal belongings stripped from victims, forged letters written to families claiming students had transferred, fallen ill, or found new callings. Every lie catalogued, every name accounted for. In a locked storeroom beneath the west wing, they found a map, hand-drawn, stained with age and sweat, marking grave sites scattered across the seminary's 400-acre property. The digging began immediately. The first body was found near the orchard, wrapped in wool, hands bound, skull shattered. Then another, beneath the root cellar, and another by the eastern ridge. 17 in total. Each matched to one of the vanished students, each buried with care, as though hiding shame rather than honoring the dead. The survivors wept. Some collapsed. Others stood in stunned silence as the names of the lost were read aloud in the chapel, each one a thread in a tapestry of horror that stretched back years. And still, James didn't speak. He walked alone to the western field, where he had once knelt in snow and watched the shadows carry Michael Brennan into the night. Now he stood over Michael's grave, lips moving in silent prayer. Justice, at last, had found its way to Sacred Heart. That evening, Montini addressed the remaining students. He spoke not as a bishop, but as a man deeply wounded by what he had witnessed. "You were meant to become shepherds," he said. "Instead, you were hunted. What happened here was not of God. It was the work of men who wore holy cloth as a mask for evil." He promised restitution, support, new placements for those who wished to continue their path toward priesthood, and counseling for those too broken to return. Most stayed, some left, but none would ever forget. As for McKenna, Doherty, and Lynch, they were transported under heavy guard to Springfield. Their trial would reveal even more: buyers across state lines, networks in other cities, money trails that linked industry to slavery in the name of religion. But that was still to come. For now, the sun set on Sacred Heart for the last time. Its bell rang once, and then never again. The grand stone building that once loomed over the Illinois prairie, once called the pride of Midwestern Catholicism, now stood silent. The halls echoed with absence. Dust settled where prayers had once risen. Sacred Heart Seminary, stripped of its illusion, had become a mausoleum of broken faith. But the true reckoning was just beginning. The trial of Seamus McKenna, Liam Doherty, and Fergus Lynch began in Springfield that autumn. The courtroom overflowed. Lawyers, Reporters, church officials, and families of the missing all pressed together in tense silence. The proceedings would last weeks. What they revealed would haunt generations. McKenna, once known as Father Walsh, sat in the defendant's chair with cold indifference, eyes scanning the crowd as if still in control. Doherty, the forger behind the finances, avoided eye contact entirely. And Lynch, the enforcer, the executioner, stared straight ahead with a blankness that chilled the room. The prosecution began with evidence. They laid out the false identities, the fake credentials, the forged letters of recommendation. They introduced maps of hidden grave sites, student rosters with altered entries, tuition records that showed full payment for boys who were never seen again. And then came the ledgers, handwritten logs of every shipment, names reduced to numbers, skills appraised like livestock, strong back, Latin fluency, minimal resistance. Destinations listed as logging camps, coal mines, industrial plants. Prices beside each one. It wasn't just murder. It was commerce. Witnesses were called. Survivors who had escaped. Farmhands who saw wagons moving at night. Townspeople who found crucifixes and rosaries half buried near their property lines. But the most devastating testimony came from James O'Malley. He stood before the court and recounted it all. The disappearances, the threats, the coded letters, the candle in the church window, the night he escaped to meet Bishop Montini. His voice never cracked, but his hands trembled. Not from fear, but from the weight of carrying truth no one else had been allowed to speak. When he finished, the room sat in absolute silence. Not even the judge moved. Then came the defense. Predictable. Hollow. They claimed persecution. They blamed anti-Catholic sentiment. They argued the students had run away, that James had fabricated everything, but the bodies in the ground said otherwise. On the final day of trial, the prosecution revealed the last piece of evidence, a handwritten journal found in Lynch's quarters, detailing burial procedures, victim selection, and disposal routes. One passage read simply, "Those who ask too much vanish first. Easier that way." The jury didn't deliberate for long. All three were found guilty on every count: murder, conspiracy, human trafficking, fraud. The judge, his voice barely containing rage, sentenced them to death by hanging. The execution was scheduled for August 15, 1851. News of the verdict swept across the nation. Papers printed front-page headlines with words like "devil in disguise" and "priests of the gallows." Religious leaders scrambled to restore public trust. Protestant critics pointed to Sacred Heart as proof of everything they had feared. And for once, even the Vatican could not remain silent. Pope Pius IX issued a rare public statement denouncing the acts and ordering sweeping reforms. Every Catholic seminary in the United States was now required to submit clergy credentials directly to Rome for verification. No more blind trust, no more silent oversight. But for the families of the 17 young men who never came home, no reform could rewrite the past. On the morning of the execution, over 5,000 people gathered at the edge of Springfield to witness the end of the men who had masqueraded as holy servants. The gallows stood tall. 3 ropes, 3 names. Seamus McKenna stepped forward first. He refused a final prayer. Liam Doherty followed, pale and silent. Fergus Lynch, last to climb the platform, looked out at the crowd, then lowered his head. The lever dropped, and with it, an era ended. But not the wounds. The execution of McKenna, Doherty, and Lynch brought a grim finality to one of the darkest chapters in American religious history. Yet for those who had lived through Sacred Heart's nightmare, closure wasn't so easily won. The dead were buried, the guilty were punished, but the questions, they lingered. Why hadn't anyone stopped it sooner? Why had the church turned a blind eye? Why had 17 lives been allowed to vanish under the guise of holiness? In the months that followed, survivors of Sacred Heart were scattered across new seminaries, missions, and, in some cases, back to the secular world. Some abandoned the priesthood altogether, unable to reconcile the faith they once loved with the horrors they had witnessed. Others, like James O'Malley, pressed forward, determined to turn the ashes of tragedy into something that might, someday, resemble redemption. James entered a Jesuit seminary in St. Louis, where he completed his training under heavy Vatican oversight. He became a priest 3 years later, but not the kind who preached from polished pulpits or basked in praise. He worked in prisons, in poorhouses, in slums where hope was thin and trust even thinner. He carried the truth of Sacred Heart with him everywhere he went, and he never stopped talking about it. His sermons, delivered in hushed tones to the forgotten corners of the country, told of false prophets and wolves' investments. He warned communities to look closely at their leaders, to ask questions, to demand accountability, not out of rebellion, but because real faith, he said, could withstand scrutiny. It was the false kind that required silence. In time, James's story reached the ears of a small group of investigative journalists working out of Cincinnati. They were preparing a series on corruption in religious institutions and sought his help. Reluctantly, he agreed, under one condition. No names of survivors would be published without consent. He would share everything else. The series ran for 7 days, each article more damning than the last. It detailed the structure of Sacred Heart's operation, the methods of recruitment, the techniques of control, the complicity of smaller parishes that had asked too few questions. It painted a picture of a system not only corrupted, but designed to conceal corruption, where men like McKenna could thrive under the cloak of holiness for years without challenge. Public response was swift and violent. Church attendance in some dioceses dropped by half. Donations evaporated. A wave of resignations rippled through seminaries and bishoprics nationwide. Some were men of good conscience who could no longer bear the weight of institutional silence. Others were pressured out when ties to Sacred Heart were uncovered. Under Vatican pressure, the American Catholic Church implemented sweeping changes. Background checks, external audits, mandatory reporting channels that bypassed diocesan leadership. Seminaries were ordered to install lay oversight boards, and no priest could be ordained without approval from a newly established ecclesiastical review committee in Rome. But even these reforms couldn't erase what had happened. The buildings remained, the grounds remained, and the shadows, those too, remained. In 1854, a fire swept through the abandoned Sacred Heart Seminary. It started in the West Wing. No one knew how. Some said lightning, others said arson. But by dawn, the structure was gone, reduced to charred stone and ash. The bell tower collapsed inward, crushing the chapel beneath it. What couldn't be buried by justice was claimed by flame. No attempt was made to rebuild. Instead, the land was quietly purchased by the church and left untouched. Grass grew high, trees crept in, time moved forward, but the earth never forgot. They say some nights, when the wind howls just right through those empty fields, you can still hear it, that single bell chime. The one that never rang again. But echoes don't die easily in a place like Sacred Heart, not when the ground still holds secrets, not when the past refuses to stay buried. In the spring of 1861, a surveyor named Elijah Hart was sent to assess the old seminary property. The church, under pressure from local authorities, had agreed to repurpose the land for a small diocesan cemetery. Officially, it was a gesture of goodwill. Unofficially, it was a way to watch the land without drawing too much attention. Hart wasn't a religious man. He'd served in the Mexican-American War, survived dysentery twice, and worked every kind of land from swamp to desert. But he wasn't prepared for what Sacred Heart would show him. The first anomaly came in the orchard. While probing the soil, Hart's crew struck something hard. 3 feet down, perfectly square, wrapped in tarred canvas. They assumed it was stone. It wasn't. It was a crate. Inside, beneath layers of straw and faded cloth, were priestly garments, robes, stoles, birrettas, but not the kind issued by any American diocese. These were older, European, hand-stitched, embroidered with family crests and regional symbols. Hart counted 12 complete sets, each one labeled with a name, and not a single name matched the roster of Sacred Heart's supposed faculty. He turned the find over to the diocese. They promised to investigate. But 2 days later, Hart was dismissed without cause. No explanation, no payment for the remainder of his contract. Still, the discovery had stirred something. The story reached a local archivist, Ruth Langley, who worked at the Historical Society in Peoria. She'd followed the Sacred Heart scandal since its exposure and believed the original case had never told the full story. Now she had proof. The robes weren't just relics. They were trophies. Each name embroidered into the fabric belonged to a real clergyman, verified through Vatican archives, who had disappeared during transatlantic voyages between 1844 and 1846. Their last known location, ships bound for the United States. None were ever seen again. Langley published her findings anonymously, citing risk to her position. But the paper made its rounds, from diocesan circles to underground publications that still whispered about Sacred Heart's buried horrors. And that's when the second discovery was made. A journal, found in a locked drawer of an antique desk acquired from an estate sale in St. Louis, confirmed to have once belonged to Rector Murphy. It was encoded, but Langley had read enough similar ciphers to recognize the structure. Over the course of months, she slowly broke it apart. What the journal revealed shattered any remaining illusion that the crimes of Sacred Heart had been isolated. There were others. Other seminaries with ghost students, other properties tied to McKenna's associates, names of buyers, towns where missing persons records had quietly been erased. A full network, small, tight-lipped, and spread across the Midwest, each one operated under the same blueprint. The horror wasn't over. It had only shifted. Langley tried to alert authorities, but her letters went unanswered. The diocesan response was silence. The Vatican issued a generic statement about misplaced relics and academic speculation. So she went public. A series of lectures, quiet gatherings, private copies of the journal circulated among trusted scholars. But she never made it to her fourth presentation. On a cold November morning in 1863, Ruth Langley was found dead in her apartment. Officially, heart failure. Unofficially, bruises on her wrists, signs of a struggle, and the journal missing. What remained was a single line from her final notes, scrawled in pencil. It never ended. It only learned to hide. Those 7 words, scribbled in haste, would outlive Ruth Langley by generations. Her death ruled natural causes, silenced no one. If anything, it amplified the whispers. People who had once dismissed Sacred Heart as an isolated tragedy began rethinking everything. Historians, clergy, and descendants of the vanished took Ruth's work underground. It moved through whispered gatherings, secret correspondences, hidden circles of truth-seekers who believed that evil never dies. It just changes its clothes. And then, nearly 40 years after the bell fell silent, something stirred again. In 1892, a young seminary student named Marcus Bellamy enrolled at St. Anselm's Preparatory School for the Clergy near Gary, Indiana. The school, newly established and well-funded, claimed affiliation with several dioceses. It promised rigorous training, moral excellence, and direct connections to prestigious parishes. Marcus was devout, eager, idealistic. He believed in the church as a force of good and saw the priesthood as a way to heal a broken world. But it didn't take long before unease crept in. The moment he arrived, he noticed things didn't add up. The student population shifted constantly, boys vanishing mid-term, new arrivals appearing without records. Lectures emphasized obedience over theology. Scripture was taught, yes, but always through the lens of subservience. Authority wasn't questioned, it was worshipped. And then there were the priests. They didn't behave like teachers. They didn't dine with students or share in chores or even walk the grounds unless necessary. They were distant, cold. 3 in particular stood out: Father Callahan, Father Drescher, and Father McIntyre. Their names didn't appear on any official seminary registry Marcus could find. One night, in the dark stillness of the chapel basement, Marcus found a torn page tucked inside an old hymnal. It was a fragment of a letter, dated 1851, addressed to someone named J. O'Malley. The handwriting was old, but sharp. It read, "The others continue. New names, new walls, but the rot has merely changed skin." That was the first time Marcus heard of Sacred Heart. He began asking questions, carefully, quietly. Most answers came in sideways glances or whispered warnings, but one older seminarian, a final-year student named Elias Fry, took pity on him. "You won't find answers in their books," Elias said. "You'll find them in the rooms they keep locked." And he was right. Late one night, Marcus followed the priests to a section of the school's east wing normally closed to students. He kept to the shadows, quiet as breath, until they disappeared through a concealed passage behind a tapestry of St. Michael. The door clicked shut. He waited, counted each heartbeat, then crept forward. The lock was old, the hinges less so. Inside he found more than he could bear: a study, firelit, lined with ancient books and maps. But it wasn't the furnishings that broke him, it was the ledgers on the table. Not historical, active. Names of current students, ratings, assignments, letters referencing fulfillment schedules. Receipts, even a crude map marking rail lines and destinations. He took 2 pages, shoved them into his cassock, and fled. He never made it back to his room. By morning, Elias Fry was gone. The official story: withdrawal due to illness. His belongings vanished the same hour. Marcus, shaken but not broken, used his one chance. He escaped. Disguised in laborer's clothing, he walked 30 miles to a rail depot and made his way to Chicago, where he met with an underground historian who had continued Ruth Langley's work. He handed over the pages. They matched. Same codes, same phrases, same system. And then Marcus said the words that would haunt every room they echoed in: "Sacred Heart never died. It just moved west." The words sent a chill through the small room where Marcus had shared his discovery. Across from him sat Theodore Langley, Ruth's great-nephew and a quiet professor of theology turned archivist. For years, Theodore had continued Ruth's work in secret, compiling notes, testimonies, and anomalies that no diocese wanted to acknowledge. Now, sitting with Marcus and staring at the ledgers he'd risked his life to retrieve, Theodore realized the nightmare his great-aunt had tried to expose hadn't ended in the flames of 1854. It had merely evolved. They spent the next several months building a new dossier, one that connected names, properties, and institutions across a half-dozen states. Seminaries that opened and closed quietly, religious retreats with no permanent students, orphanages with suspicious turnover, always operated by the same type of men, charismatic, authoritative, and barely traceable. The language in the documents remained consistent. Code phrases like obedient spirit, exemplary submission, and assigned labor. Payments disguised as donations. Transport routes buried beneath religious pilgrimages. It was a machine with a holy face and a predator's heart. By 1893, they had gathered enough to act. Theodore reached out to a man named Walter Green, a former seminarian turned Pinkerton agent. Green had left the church after uncovering corruption within a New Orleans parish and now specialized in covert investigations for sensitive clients. He didn't flinch when Theodore laid out the truth. He simply asked where to start. They chose St. Anselm's. The school had grown quietly since Marcus's escape, adding dormitories, expanding chapel space, and attracting endowments from mysterious foundations. Green infiltrated as a groundskeeper, keeping his identity hidden. Within weeks, he confirmed everything. He saw boys taken at night, letters intercepted, a room of chained trunks with personal items labeled by initials, and beneath the chapel's altar, a trapdoor that led to what could only be described as a transit hub. Green wrote everything down: photos, names, schedules. But before he could extract the evidence, he vanished. Theodore and Marcus received his final letter, postmarked July 3, 1893. It contained a list of priests currently at the school, a sketched floor plan, and a warning. They're expecting something. I've been made. 3 days later, a fire tore through St. Anselm's. Official reports blamed faulty gas lines. Witnesses described a thunderous explosion, flames leaping from the east wing, and screaming that didn't sound like any drill. 17 students perished, along with 4 faculty members. Theodore didn't believe it for a second. Neither did Marcus, but without Green's body and with most records destroyed in the blaze, the trail grew cold once again. The church issued statements of grief and sympathy. Donations poured in. And within a year, St. Anselm's was rebuilt on a new site, this time under a different name. They called it Our Lady of Perpetual Redemption. The pattern repeated: open, operate, harvest, burn, rebrand. The men behind it weren't just criminals. They were architects of a system perfected over decades. They moved like ghosts, crossing state lines, changing identities, always cloaked investments and protected by the sanctity of trust. But Marcus didn't run this time. He dedicated his life to tracking them, quietly, relentlessly. Teaching by day, investigating by night. He followed whispers, traced shipping manifests, attended ordinations with a watchful eye. He trained others, men and women who had lost brothers, sons, friends to disappearances no one investigated. They formed what came to be called the Watch, not an organization, not a club, just a network of silent sentinels who knew that evil didn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it wore a collar. Sometimes it offered blessings with blood-stained hands. And as the 20th century approached, Sacred Heart's shadow stretched farther than anyone had dared imagine. But its hunters had multiplied, and they were no longer afraid. By the turn of the century, the Watch had grown into a quiet force, an unspoken resistance operating in the margins. Priests, former students, investigators, even grieving families had joined its ranks. They shared coded letters, warnings passed through confessionals, hidden files buried in monastery archives. But the men behind Sacred Heart's legacy adapted just as quickly. They shifted away from fixed seminaries. Instead, they favored mobile orders, roaming missionary schools, traveling retreats, pop-up novitiates that never stayed in one place too long. They used new names, new creeds, but their intent never changed. They didn't spread faith. They harvested obedience, and every few years, someone else vanished. In 1907, a boy named Thomas Leland disappeared from a summer seminary retreat in Kansas. 2 weeks later, another student, Peter Crane, was found wandering near a rail line in Missouri, traumatized, dehydrated, and muttering Latin phrases through cracked lips. He spoke of tunnels, of masks, of being told to forget his name. He was 10 years old. The church claimed it was a kidnapping. Authorities chalked it up to vagrants, but the Watch knew better. Their network had tracked that same retreat through Iowa, Nebraska, and Colorado. Different locations, same clergy. Always boys between 9 and 14, always isolated venues. This wasn't chance. It was a blueprint. And then came the breakthrough no one expected. In 1911, a young archivist in Baltimore named Clara Winslow uncovered a sealed crate mislabeled as liturgy supplies in the basement of an abandoned rectory. Inside were dozens of journals, rosters, and ledgers, all bearing the insignia of Sacred Heart. Somehow, one of the original caches had survived the purge. She shared it with the watch. The documents included logs from as early as 1847, all the way through 1890. It proved that the operation had never stopped. It had simply fragmented, splintered into regional cells, each one autonomous, each one careful to bury itself under layers of legitimate church operations. The journals listed relocation protocols, name-switching procedures, even end-of-cycle protocols, for when too many questions arose. The most chilling entry came from 1889, handwritten in red ink. We've burned 5 sites, rebuilt 4. Chicago is too hot. Denver and Tulsa are viable. Recruit young. Rotate names. Loyalty is currency. Obedience is capital. The language wasn't religious. It was military. With the evidence now irrefutable, the watch shifted tactics. They stopped waiting for church approval. They began whistleblowing directly to secular authorities. Some allies within law enforcement emerged, officers who had long suspected something darker moving under the surface of holy institutions. Raids began. Between 1912 and 1920, 6 separate facilities were shuttered. In each one, investigators found coded documents, forged records, or personal items belonging to boys declared runaways. But public coverage was minimal. The church intervened. Settlements were paid. Stories disappeared. Still, the watch pressed forward. But nothing prepared them for 1924. That year, a man claiming to be a former Sacred Heart student walked into a small parish in Oregon. He refused to give a name. Dirty, thin, covered in scars. He handed the priest a bundle wrapped in cloth, a set of original vestments from Sacred Heart's Illinois Seminary, perfectly preserved. He said only one thing before vanishing. They were never just priests, they were gatekeepers. Inside the cloth, along with the vestments, was a note written in Latin. When translated, it read, "The door remains open. You may have scattered the shepherds, but the flock still follows." To the watch, it was a warning. Sacred Heart wasn't just a place or a group. It was a design, a dark theology that used faith as camouflage, ritual as weapon, and obedience as the leash. And somewhere, someone was still holding the leash. The message was clear. Sacred Heart was never just a building. It was a philosophy, an infection disguised as devotion, and no matter how many names were exposed or ledgers seized, its true strength lay in secrecy. By the 1930s, the watch had gone almost entirely underground. The church had grown more protective, more corporate. Whistleblowers were discredited. Investigations were rerouted. And in some cases, those who spoke out vanished without explanation. Still, the watch endured. Some members became teachers, journalists, historians. Others entered the clergy itself, not to serve the institution, but to monitor it from within. They documented irregularities, photographed records, tracked strange transfers, always working in shadows, always suspecting that another Sacred Heart could rise at any moment. And it did. In 1952, a remote monastery school in Montana burned under mysterious circumstances. Survivors spoke of masked instructors, locked dormitories, and students who went away after failing tests of obedience. One survivor, Daniel Cortez, escaped and wrote a letter detailing the horrors. That letter found its way to a retired member of the watch. The details were unmistakable. Same phrases, same punishments, same ritualistic language. Only this time, there was one difference. The perpetrators weren't just false priests, they were real ones. Ordained, documented, protected. Sacred Heart's poison had moved into the bloodstream of the institution itself. From that moment, the Watch changed its mission. No longer focused solely on exposure, it now aimed for prevention. Members quietly counseled vulnerable families, warned local authorities, leaked just enough to get suspicious schools shut down without revealing their source. They became ghost shepherds, protecting flocks from dangers they would never fully understand. But every decade brought new challenges, new disguises, new names. In 1978, the remains of a teenage boy were found beneath the altar of a shuttered church in Vermont. His death was ruled accidental. The Watch knew better. In 1989, a group of seminarians in New Mexico reported strange psychological conditioning programs disguised as spiritual disciplines. One student broke his silence and was later institutionalized. In 1996, an anonymous package was delivered to a journalist in Boston. Inside were scans of journals that bore Sacred Heart's original crest, modified but still recognizable. The entries detailed obedience trials, labor assignments, and something new: international transfers. The reach was no longer national. It was global. And then came 2002. The Boston Globe's Spotlight team broke open the systemic abuse within the Catholic Church. It shocked the world, uncovered hundreds of perpetrators, thousands of victims. And yet, among all the headlines and court testimonies, no mention was made of Sacred Heart. Not by name, but those within the Watch knew what they were seeing: the blueprint, the methods, the cover-ups. It had all started in that cold Illinois seminary over a century and a half before. Today, the ruins of Sacred Heart remain buried beneath grass and forest. No memorial stands there. No plaque. Just empty land where 17 boys were buried and 1,000 more were broken. But the bell still echoes, sometimes in the cries of survivors, sometimes in the silence of those too afraid to speak, and sometimes, just sometimes, in the hearts of those who still remember. The Watch still exists, quiet, patient, waiting for the next sign. Because they know the truth that institutions refuse to accept. Faith is not immune to evil, and monsters don't always come from the outside. Sometimes they preach from the pulpit. Sometimes they whisper sermons while tightening a chain. And sometimes they build schools, not to enlighten, but to erase. Sacred Heart was not a story. It was a warning, and that warning still stands. Because when obedience is demanded without question, when silence is rewarded above truth, and when men claim to speak for God but hide behind locked doors, that's when you listen for the bell. Because if you hear it, you're already too close.